A man in tactical gear walks alone into a village where smoke rises from chimneys, where chickens scratch in the dirt, where laundry hangs motionless on lines between stone houses built when Spain still ruled half the world. He knocks on a wooden door, asks a question in Spanish about a missing girl. The villager inside turns slowly, and his eyes catch the light wrong. They glow. Not metaphorically, actually glow. Yellow and flat, like an animal reflecting headlights on a rural highway. The man doesn't answer the question. He picks up an axe, and Leon Kennedy, 2 years removed from surviving Raccoon City's zombie outbreak, realizes he's walked into something that makes that nightmare look like a rehearsal. This analysis will explore how Resident Evil 4 transformed bioweapon horror from mindless infection into strategic parasitism, how cult manipulation becomes indistinguishable from biological control, and why the game's pivot from zombies to intelligent infected enemies changed survival horror permanently. Over the next several hours, we'll trace Leon's mission through 3 distinct territories controlled by Los Illuminados, a cult that worships parasitic organisms as divine gifts rather than biological weapons. We'll examine how the parasite Las Plagas creates hierarchy through infection, how isolation enables institutional abuse regardless of geography or era, why survival under parasitic influence requires different strategies than survival under viral outbreak, and how one man's grief over ancestral shame becomes the foundation for attempted global domination. By the end, you'll understand why intelligence makes infected hosts more dangerous than mindlessness ever could, how bioweapon research migrated from corporations to cults without changing its fundamental exploitation, and why some horrors persist because the systems enabling them adapt faster than the people fighting them. Quick roll call before we get into it. Drop a comment with where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I want to see where this signal lands and what hour finds you here. Whether you are settling in for the night, working through a long shift, or just keeping company with the dark, let me know you are tuned in. So now let us kick back, turn down the lights, and start. Chapter 1. The Village and the Architecture of Parasitic Control. Before Leon arrives in Spain, before the cult kidnaps Ashley Graham, before Osmond Sadler opens sealed caverns beneath a castle to resurrect parasites that should have stayed buried, there's a moment that defines what makes Las Plagas fundamentally different from every virus Leon encountered in Raccoon City. Parasites don't destroy cognition, they redirect it. The infected still think, still plan, still coordinate. They just serve different priorities now. Priorities implanted through neural hijacking that leaves the host believing their new behaviors emerged from personal conviction rather than biological invasion. Picture a research laboratory hidden on an island off the Spanish coast. Scientists hired from the dissolved Umbrella Corporation work with samples of organisms discovered in sealed ruins, organisms that survive centuries in dormant states waiting for excavation to wake them. The researchers aren't developing treatments or studying epidemiology, they're engineering dominance hierarchies into parasitic life cycles, creating strains that allow certain hosts to control others through biological command structures embedded in nervous systems. This isn't accidental mutation, this is intentional design, building weapons that transform human populations into armies where loyalty runs deeper than ideology because it's coded into spinal tissue. Los Illuminados translates to the Enlightened Ones. The cult claims ancient origins, positioning themselves as inheritors of primal religions that understood truths modern society forgot. Archaeological evidence suggests some version of the cult existed for centuries in rural Spain, practicing rituals that incorporated parasitic organisms into spiritual frameworks. Las Plagas, the parasites themselves, were treated as sacred beings rather than biological hazards. Infection wasn't contamination. It was transcendence, surrendering individual will to collective purpose mediated through organisms that made such surrender inevitable rather than voluntary. Understanding what happened in the village requires understanding what happened to the village first. The isolation matters. Valdalobos sits in mountainous terrain near the Spanish coast, accessible by limited roads that wind through landscape empty enough that screams don't carry to neighboring populations. The distance from oversight creates permission structures similar to what enabled Umbrella's mansion laboratory in Raccoon Forest. When institutions operate beyond the reach of external accountability, when geography creates natural barriers that prevent witnesses, the constraints on behavior shift from external enforcement to internal ethics, and when the people making decisions have already committed to treating human subjects as experimental resources, those ethics collapse entirely. The cult's revival began when Osmond Sadler arrived in the region claiming to be a prophet and healer. Accounts of his background vary. Some sources describe him as an outsider who discovered the cult's history and exploited it for personal gain. Others claim he descended from founding families forcibly exiled centuries earlier when the first Salazar Castellan suppressed Los Illuminados and sealed Las Plagas in caverns beneath his castle. Regardless of origin, Sadler understood how to weaponize both religious conviction and biological mechanisms to build power structures that couldn't be dismantled through conventional resistance. Sadler's entry point was Ramon Salazar, the 20th Castellan of Salazar Castle and 8th Count of Valdalobos. Ramon was 20 years old when events unfold, the youngest Castellan in the Salazar line, though his appearance suggested something dramatically different. His diminutive stature resembled a 10-year-old child. His gray hair and deeply wrinkled face gave him the appearance of someone in their 60s or 70s. The physical presentation resulted from parasitic infection during childhood. When Sadler approached the Salazar family offering to cure Ramon of a life-threatening illness his doctors couldn't treat, Ramon's mother Catalina invited Sadler into their home despite Ramon's father Diego's objections. Sadler cured Ramon through parasitization, introducing Las Plagas organisms that stabilized his condition while permanently altering his development. Ramon inherited the castle young after his parents died, leaving him the last of the Salazar line. The isolation created vulnerability that Sadler exploited comprehensively. Ramon developed cruel tendencies even before parasitic influence fully manifested. He murdered a servant who called him Pulgarcito, Little Thumb, behind his back, killing her by throwing vitriol in her face. The cruelty wasn't aberration. It was pattern, documented behavior that made him unpopular among villagers who remembered when Castellans served their communities rather than using them as resources. Sadler positioned himself as the father Ramon never had, providing validation and purpose while simultaneously manipulating Ramon's guilt about his ancestor Gregorio Salazar, the first Castellan who suppressed Los Illuminados and sealed Las Plagas away. Los Illuminados mythology framed the Salazar family as tainted by generational sin, stained by their ancestors' decision to imprison sacred organisms rather than worship them. Ramon internalized this narrative completely. He came to see unsealing the caverns not as betrayal of his family legacy, but as atonement, correcting ancestral mistakes by releasing what should never have been contained. Ramon hired workers from the nearby village to excavate the ruins beneath his castle. The workers expected to find fossilized remains, biological artifacts of historical interest but no practical danger. What they found instead were mummified plagas containing viable spores. The miners inhaled these spores during excavation. The organisms regenerated inside their bodies, creating new complete parasites from dormant genetic material that had survived centuries waiting for host tissue to activate growth. The miners became the first modern ganados, the infected masses whose Spanish name translates simply to cattle. The transformation wasn't immediate. Las Plagas operates differently from viruses that rapidly destroy cognitive function. The parasite embeds in the nervous system, growing along spinal tissue, extending tendrils into brain structures that regulate behavior and decision-making. The host remains conscious throughout infection. They continue working, eating, sleeping, maintaining daily routines, but something shifts beneath observable behavior. Priorities reorganize around serving whoever controls the dominant strain parasites, creating loyalty that feels like personal conviction because the neural hijacking that produces it operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. Sadler's research team, staffed by former Umbrella scientists who brought expertise from Nemesis development and other bioweapon projects, worked to enhance the parasites beyond their natural capabilities. They created several distinct strains. Subordinate Plagueis infected most hosts, creating Gonados, who retained skills and memories but lost autonomy in decision-making. Dominant Plagueis went to leadership figures, granting them control over subordinate hosts while preserving the leader's sense of self. This was engineered hierarchy, building command structures into biological systems, so control couldn't be resisted through willpower or deprogramming because the control operated through mechanisms willpower couldn't access. Betorres Mendez served as village chief and Catholic priest before Sadler's arrival. His conversion marked the cult's expansion from castle to community. Mendez held both political and spiritual authority in the region. When he abandoned Catholicism for Los Illuminados, when he accepted dominant strain infection and began preaching the cult's theology from his position of institutional trust, the village followed. The conversion wasn't gradual persuasion, it was systematic infection, masked as religious ceremony. The cult conducted blood purification rituals, where villagers were injected with plaga eggs under the pretense of spiritual cleansing. The eggs hatched inside their bodies. The parasites matured along neural pathways, and the villagers became Ganados, who believed their new devotion to Sadler represented personal spiritual awakening rather than biological hijacking. Children died during this process. Their bodies couldn't sustain parasitic growth. The plagas consumed them from inside, killing them before the organisms fully matured. The cult documented these deaths as unfortunate but acceptable losses, casualties in a larger project where individual lives mattered less than collective transformation. This pattern appears repeatedly in bioweapon research across the Resident Evil timeline. Whether corporate laboratories or cult compounds, whether motivated by profit or religious conviction, the institutions conducting human experimentation rationalize casualties as necessary costs rather than preventable murders. By 2004, when Leon arrives, the village has been fully converted. Every adult hosts Las Plagas. They farm, maintain buildings, attend cult services at the church, and kill any outsiders who enter their territory. The violence isn't random aggression, it's coordinated defense of cult operations, executed by people who retained enough intelligence to use weapons effectively, set traps, communicate tactical information, and adapt strategies when initial approaches fail. This makes them exponentially more dangerous than Raccoon City's zombies. Zombies shamble toward noise and movement, easily predictable, relatively simple to avoid through careful positioning. Ganados hunt with intent. They flank, they ambush, they wait for mistakes, and they exploit those mistakes with precision that reflects intact cognitive function, redirected toward eliminating threats to Los Illuminados. Leon's arrival triggers the village's defense protocols immediately. The parasite ensures absolute loyalty to Sadler's objectives. Any outsider represents potential interference with those objectives. Therefore, any outsider must die. The logic is simple. The execution is ruthless. Leon kills the villager in self-defense during the struggle, but the body doesn't stay down. Moments later, the villager rises again, neck twisted at an impossible angle, and something emerges from the wound. Tentacles, writhing appendages that shouldn't exist in human anatomy, sprout from broken tissue. This is the plaga manifesting physically when the host body sustains damage that should be fatal. The parasite can take direct control, using the host's body as a biological vehicle even after conventional death. Leon kills the villager a second time, this time destroying enough tissue that the plaga can't continue using the corpse. The two police officers who brought Leon die before he returns to their vehicle. One has his throat cut and his body fed to Delago, a massive aquatic creature living in the lake, one of Los Illuminados' earliest successful bioweapon experiments, created by exposing native wildlife to plagas and allowing the parasites to mutate the creature into something capable of capsizing boats and drowning anyone who ventures onto the water. The other officer is ritually burned at a stake in the village center. his corpse displayed as a warning and a sacrifice, his eyes gouged out in a practice that carries both religious significance and practical purpose within cult ceremonies. They swarm from buildings, coordinate attacks from multiple directions, and one wields a chainsaw. The siege continues until church bells ring in the distance. The sound triggers something in the Ganados' neural programming. They stop attacking, they turn and walk toward the church. The bells weren't rung by cult leadership. Ada Wong activated them from inside the church, saving Leon without his knowledge. Ada's presence in the village serves Albert Wesker's agenda, though the full complexity of her mission and her eventual betrayal of Wesker's plans won't become clear until much later. For now, Leon benefits from her intervention without understanding that someone else is operating in the area, someone with objectives that occasionally align with his survival, but fundamentally serve different purposes. Leon finds Luis Serra tied up in a wardrobe, mouth taped shut, clearly imprisoned rather than participating voluntarily in cult activities. Luis claims to be a former cop from Madrid, taken captive by the cult. This is partially true. Luis was a cop, he is a captive, but he's also a former Los Illuminados researcher who helped develop enhanced Plaga strains and the bioweapons derived from them. His capture resulted from stealing a Plaga sample and attempting to trade it to Ada Wong in exchange for extraction from the region. Sadler ordered him imprisoned until the sample's location could be extracted through interrogation or torture. Vitores Mendez appears and knocks both Leon and Luis unconscious. They wake chained together in a different location, awaiting execution or conversion depending on which serves Los Illuminados' interests better. They free themselves from restraints and escape, though Luis runs off immediately, prioritizing recovery of his hidden research and the stolen sample over collaborative survival. Leon's exploration of the village reveals the architecture of how the cult maintains control. The Ganados continue performing their pre-infection roles. Farmers still farm, builders still maintain structures, but everything they do serves Los Illuminados, rather than their own interests or families. The parasite doesn't erase personality or skill, it redirects purpose. A farmer who once grew crops to feed his family now grows crops to sustain cult operations. A mother who once protected her children now attacks anyone who threatens Sadler's plans. The tragedy isn't loss of intelligence. The tragedy is intelligence preserved but enslaved. People who still think and feel but can no longer choose what those thoughts and feelings prioritize. Leon finds notes scattered throughout the village, documents left by Luis that explain Las Plagas mechanics and provide tactical information about vulnerable points in various bioweapons. The notes reveal several key facts. Las Plagas embeds in the central nervous system, making surgical removal impossible once the organism matures without killing the host. The parasite can be suppressed through specific drugs that slow its growth, buying time but not providing a cure. And there exists a machine capable of destroying plagas before they fully mature, technology Luis developed and hid in his laboratory, knowing he might need it eventually. Leon also encounters the Merchant, a figure who somehow operates independently within Los Illuminados territory without being attacked. The Merchant's eyes glow with the same yellow luminescence that marks plaga infection, suggesting he's a host. Yet he trades weapons and supplies to Leon rather than trying to kill him. His motivation remains unclear. His dialogue suggests profit drives him, that he views Leon as a customer rather than an enemy, that commerce transcends the cult's ideological concerns. This creates a bizarre dynamic where Leon can purchase weapons and healing items from an infected merchant between battles against other infected villagers, as if capitalism functions as its own separate system that parasitic organisms can't fully override. The village section establishes several themes that will continue throughout Leon's mission. Isolation enables institutional abuse because distance from oversight removes external constraints on behavior. Parasitic control differs fundamentally from viral infection because preserved intelligence makes hosts more effective instruments of whoever commands them. And survival requires adapting to enemies who think strategically rather than react instinctively, enemies who learn from failed attacks and adjust tactics accordingly. Leon's primary objective in the village is locating Ashley Graham. Intelligence suggests she's being held in the church at the village's edge, overlooking the area from higher ground. Reaching the church requires obtaining keys scattered across the area, keys held by Ganados who won't surrender them voluntarily. Leon fights through fortified positions, survives ambushes in enclosed spaces, and kills Ganados who keep coming despite mounting casualties, because the parasites ensure they value Sadler's objectives above their own survival. The church itself is locked behind a door that requires a specific insignia to open. Leon solves the mechanism, enters, and finds Ashley imprisoned in a small room. She's the daughter of the United States President, kidnapped while returning home from university. Her abduction wasn't random. It was precisely calculated, executed by operatives on Sadler's orders to serve a specific strategic purpose that goes beyond simple ransom or political leverage. Ashley has already been infected with Las Plagas. Sadler injected her personally, implanting a parasite that will mature and grant him control over her decision-making. The plan is elegant in its cruelty. Return Ashley to her father, let the plaga mature undetected, then use her to infect the president and other high-ranking officials in the executive branch, Congress, the Department of Justice, military leadership, and influential private sector figures. Once infected, these leaders become puppets operating under Sadler's control while maintaining their public positions and authority. The United States government continues functioning normally from external observation, but internally every major decision serves Los Illuminados rather than American interests. This plan represents evolution in bioweapon strategy. Previous threats in the Resident Evil timeline sought profit through weapon sales or power through direct military action. Sadler's approach is more insidious. He's not trying to destroy the United States, he's trying to hollow it out, replacing its decision-making apparatus with biological mechanisms that make genuine independence impossible while preserving the appearance of sovereignty, using individual hosts to infiltrate and control entire governmental systems. Leon rescues Ashley from the church, but their escape is interrupted by Osmond Sadler's first direct appearance. Sadler appears before them, calm and confident, explaining his intentions without concern that revealing them might enable resistance. He notes that both Leon and Ashley are now infected, that their plagas will mature regardless of their actions, that struggling only delays inevitable conversion. Then he leaves, allowing Ganados to pursue Leon and Ashley rather than killing them immediately. This pattern continues throughout the game. Sadler could execute Leon multiple times but chooses to let him live, viewing his continued survival as useful for testing cult defenses and providing distraction while more important preparations proceed. Leon and Ashley flee the church and attempt to navigate back through the village to extraction points outside Los Illuminados territory. But the geography works against them. The village is designed to funnel movement into kill zones where Ganados can mass for overwhelming numerical advantage. Buildings have limited exits, streets channel into choke points, and the Ganados know the terrain better than Leon does, using familiarity to set ambushes and cut off retreat routes. The escape attempt fails when Leon and Ashley are captured and transported to Salazar Castle, a massive fortress on elevated ground overlooking the region. The castle represents the next phase of Leon's mission and the next layer of Los Illuminados operations. Where the village served as recruitment and conversion center, the castle functions as research facility and command center, housing laboratories where enhanced plaga strains are developed, and strategic planning occurs for the cult's expansion beyond regional dominance toward global influence. But reaching the castle means surviving encounters with bioweapons far more dangerous than standard Ganados. The village section introduced parasitic control and coordinated human opposition. The castle section will introduce what happens when parasites infect non-human hosts, when decades of umbrella bioweapon research combine with Las Plagas organisms to create hybrids that retain neither humanity nor predictable behavior patterns. Leon looks up at the castle as church bells ring again in the distance. The sound used to summon Ganados to worship. Now it feels like a funeral toll, marking the transition from one nightmare into something exponentially worse. Ashley asks how they'll get through whatever waits inside those walls. Leon doesn't answer immediately, because the honest answer is that he doesn't know, that the intelligence he received before the mission didn't include information about laboratories full of biological experiments or cult leadership using parasites to build command hierarchies, that he's operating blind against opponents who can coordinate their defenses while his infection progresses toward the point where his own body will betray him. The village falls silent behind them. Smoke still rises from chimneys, laundry still hangs on lines, but the people who lived here, who raised families and practiced their trades and celebrated festivals, are gone. Not dead, which would almost be mercy. Gone in the sense that the persons they were no longer control their actions, replaced by biological programming that makes their continued existence serve someone else's purposes. Parasitic control doesn't kill identity through destruction. It kills identity through redirection, leaving hosts who still breathe and think and remember, but who serve objectives implanted rather than chosen. And this is only the beginning. Chapter 2: The Castle and the Manufacturing of Monsters. Salazar Castle wasn't built for defense against external armies. The architecture reveals different priorities. Narrow corridors funnel movement into predetermined paths. Hidden passages connect rooms that appear isolated from building plans. And certain chambers feature mechanisms designed not to keep invaders out, but to trap them inside, converting defensive positions into execution rooms where the castle itself becomes a weapon through controlled environment manipulation. Ramon Salazar stands in the audience hall when Leon and Ashley first enter. Flanked by two figures in hooded robes whose faces remain hidden, he introduces himself with theatrical formality, explaining that he's the 8th Castellan of this magnificent structure, granted great power by Lord Sadler, waiting to welcome his brothers of the same blood. Leon rejects the kinship immediately. He's not infected by choice. He's not serving Sadler voluntarily. And whatever biological connection the Plagueis create doesn't override his intention to destroy the cult and rescue Ashley regardless of parasitic influence attempting to redirect his priorities. Salazar's appearance contradicts his age in ways that make him unsettling beyond mere physical abnormality. 20 years old, but resembling elderly decay, small enough to be mistaken for a child, but carrying himself with authority that assumes absolute obedience. His voice remains calm regardless of circumstances, as if Leon's resistance merely represents mild inconvenience rather than genuine threat to cult operations. This calmness reflects either supreme confidence in Los Illuminados' defenses or complete detachment from realistic threat assessment, possibly both. The two hooded figures are verdugos, bioweapons created through combining human hosts with insect DNA and enhanced Plagueis. They serve as Salazar's personal bodyguards, obeying his commands with mechanical precision while retaining enough intelligence to adapt tactics during combat. Their creation required extensive experimentation, testing combinations of genetic material until researchers identified configurations that produced stable organisms capable of following complex orders without requiring constant oversight. Luis Serra's research contributed to their development, a fact that haunts him as he attempts to atone for enabling horrors he helped design. Salazar's role within Los Illuminados extends beyond simply providing access to the sealed caverns. The castle functions as central research facility where plaga enhancement occurs, where bioweapon hybrids are tested, where strategic planning for global expansion takes place in chambers his ancestors used for governing legitimate political affairs. His wealth-funded equipment purchases from black markets flooded with umbrella technology after the corporation's collapse. His authority as Castellan prevented Spanish government oversight that might have detected illegal human experimentation, and his conversion to cult ideology provided religious justification for atrocities that purely secular bioweapon research would struggle to rationalize even to participants. The castle contains multiple enemy types. Novistadors are human-insect hybrids that can fly, turn invisible, and attack from angles that ground-based opponents can't easily exploit. They resulted from infecting hosts with plagas, then introducing insect genetic material, allowing the parasite to incorporate arthropod traits into human physiology. The transformation destroys most human characteristics, leaving creatures that retain problem-solving intelligence but express it through predatory behavior patterns, more insect than mammal. Gyrodors are ganados whose eyes have been removed and replaced with plagous organisms that extend sensory capabilities while eliminating vision. They navigate through sound, attacking anything that makes noise with claws attached to their arms. The claws can penetrate walls, destroy cover, and kill Leon in single strikes if they connect. But their blindness creates exploitable vulnerabilities. Silent movement prevents detection, and each Gyrodor has a plaga growth on its back that functions as critical weak point, destroying the organism if damaged sufficiently. The castle's traps reveal Salazar's mindset. He's not trying to kill Leon efficiently, he's playing with him, creating elaborate scenarios where survival remains barely possible if Leon performs perfectly. One room features a massive statue of Salazar himself that walks on mechanical legs, crushing anything in its path, while Leon searches for mechanisms to disable it. Another chamber fills with water while Ganados attack from elevated positions, forcing Leon to solve puzzles while managing threats simultaneously. These aren't security measures designed by professionals. These are sadistic games designed by someone who views Leon's suffering as entertainment rather than merely necessary elimination of obstacles. Salazar taunts Leon through communication systems, hijacking Leon's radio frequency to deliver mocking commentary about his progress. He knows Leon's location constantly through surveillance throughout the castle. He references Ashley's status, noting when she's been recaptured, describing the ritual that will convert her into full ganado. The taunting serves psychological warfare, attempting to demoralize Leon by emphasizing that resistance only delays inevitable outcomes rather than preventing them. Luis reappears during the castle section. He provides suppressant drugs that slow plaga growth, buying time before the parasites mature to the point where removal becomes impossible. But the drugs aren't permanent solutions. They're temporary measures that address symptoms without curing infection. Luis knows this. He's working on locating his laboratory where the removal machine remains hidden, but reaching it requires navigating through Los Illuminados' most heavily defended territory. The complexity of Luis's position becomes clearer as events progress. He's not simply a former cop who got caught in cult operations. He's a former researcher who actively contributed to developing the bioweapons now being deployed. His expertise created the enhanced plagas that make Ganados more dangerous. His experiments produced the hybrid organisms that hunt through the castle. His technology enabled mass infection through engineered organisms that reproduce faster and embed more thoroughly than natural parasites would. He's trying to help Leon now, but his help attempts to address problems he helped create, a dynamic that makes redemption complicated even when intentions shift toward genuine remorse. Understanding Luis requires understanding how bioweapon research recruits talent. Umbrella, and later Los Illuminados, didn't typically hire scientists who explicitly wanted to create weapons of mass destruction. They hired intelligent people who wanted to solve interesting problems, who wanted resources to pursue cutting-edge research, who wanted recognition for revolutionary discoveries. The organizations framed research in terms that sounded legitimate: study parasite biology, enhance host resilience, develop medical treatments for neurological disorders. Only gradually did the actual applications become clear. And by the time researchers understood they were building weapons rather than studying organisms, they'd already invested years of work and formed professional relationships that made walking away psychologically difficult, even when ethical objections emerged. Luis left Los Illuminados after understanding Sadler's true intentions, but his departure came late. The enhanced plagas already existed, the bioweapons already functioned, the infection protocols already worked. His decision to steal a sample and trade it to outside organizations represented attempt to prevent further proliferation, but it couldn't undo the proliferation that had already occurred. This creates a pattern visible throughout the Resident Evil timeline. Individual scientists developing consciences and attempting to limit damage their previous work enabled, but the systems that employed them continue operating, finding new researchers willing to take positions that freshly concerned individuals vacated. The castle reveals how parasitic control creates different social dynamics than viral infection. Raccoon City's zombies presented collective threat through sheer numbers and persistence, but they couldn't coordinate sophisticated strategies. Salazar's forces demonstrate what becomes possible when infection preserves intelligence while controlling priorities. Ganados use firearms, operate siege equipment, coordinate flanking maneuvers, and adapt tactics when initial approaches fail. The Plagas don't make them stupid. The Plagas make them absolutely loyal to command structures they can't consciously resist, creating armies where every soldier fights with human intelligence but inhuman dedication to objectives assigned by whoever controls the dominant strain parasites. This distinction matters because it changes what survival requires. Escaping zombies meant avoiding detection and conserving resources while navigating toward extraction. Fighting Ganados requires treating each encounter as tactical engagement against intelligent opponents who learn from failed attacks. Leon can't rely on enemies making predictable mistakes. He has to anticipate adaptation, prepare for coordinated responses, and recognize that every victory teaches Los Illuminados something about his capabilities that they'll use to design better countermeasures. Ashley gets recaptured despite Leon's efforts to protect her. Novistadors overwhelm their position, using flight and numbers to separate them. Ganados drag Ashley to a ritual chamber where Salazar oversees her conversion ceremony, forcing her to drink a substance that accelerates plaga maturation. The ritual holds religious significance for Los Illuminados, framing biological infection as spiritual baptism, presenting parasitic invasion as divine gift rather than violent assault on bodily autonomy. This reframing appears throughout cult operations. What would be described as torture in secular contexts becomes purification ritual. What would be called enslavement becomes enlightenment. Language shifts create permission structures that let participants view atrocities as sacraments. Leon tracks Ashley to the ritual chamber but arrives too late to prevent the ceremony's completion. Salazar mocks him, noting that Ashley now belongs to Lord Sadler rather than her father, that her return to America will serve purposes the president can't imagine, that Leon's rescue mission has become meaningless because the person he's trying to save no longer exists in the form she held when kidnapped. This is psychological warfare again, attempting to break Leon's resolve by suggesting his efforts have already failed, even if he manages to physically extract Ashley from the region. But Salazar underestimates something critical about plaga infection. The parasites control priorities and loyalty. They don't erase personality or emotional bonds entirely. Ashley's plaga compels her to serve Sadler's objectives, but residual elements of her identity remain accessible under certain conditions. Leon understands this intuitively even without full medical knowledge of how parasitic control works. He keeps talking to Ashley as if she's still present, maintains verbal contact even when her responses suggest plaga has dominated her decision-making, operates on assumption that connection might persist beneath biological override. This becomes important later when they reach Luis's laboratory and use his removal machine. The technology works by targeting plaga tissue specifically, destroying the organisms without killing the host, but it requires that hosts willingly enter the machine and remain still during the extraction process. If Ashley's identity had been completely erased by infection, if no part of her retained capacity to choose cooperation, the machine would be useless because she wouldn't voluntarily undergo extraction. Leon's faith that some aspect of her persists turns out to be correct, though whether this reflects genuine preservation of self or merely failure of plaga maturation to complete before extraction remains ambiguous. Luis's death occurs in the castle's lower levels, in mining tunnels where workers originally excavated the sealed caverns and breathed spores that initiated modern Los Illuminados' resurrection. The death differs between game versions. Both versions result in Luis dying before he can complete his redemption arc, Killed by the cult, he tried to escape after helping create the weapons that made the cult dangerous. Luis's final moments focus on helping Leon rather than self-preservation. He gives Leon suppressant pills. He provides the key to his laboratory, where the removal machine waits. He shares information about weak points in upcoming bioweapons. Then he dies, slowly, blood loss and trauma overwhelming his body, while he maintains consciousness long enough to ensure Leon understands what he needs to survive. The death is tragic specifically because Luis's expertise could have accelerated solutions to problems he helped create. But his knowledge dies with him, leaving Leon to figure out survival strategies without the benefit of insider understanding of how Los Illuminados' bioweapons function. Krauser's appearance deserves extended analysis because his presence reveals layers of betrayal operating simultaneously within Los Illuminados' operations. Jack Krauser served as Leon's partner during Operation Javier, 3 years before current events, a mission to South America investigating drug lord Javier Hidalgo's use of bioweapons. The operation went catastrophically wrong. In the original timeline, Leon and Krauser were the only survivors from their team. In the remake, Krauser led an entire unit that died when the United States government refused to authorize evacuation, leaving them to be overrun by bioweapon attacks that killed everyone except Krauser. The mission left Krauser physically damaged. His left arm sustained injuries that never properly healed, forcing his discharge from active military service. But the physical damage mattered less than the psychological transformation. Krauser emerged from Operation Javier believing that conventional human capabilities were insufficient, that soldiers without bioweapon enhancement would always lose to enhanced opponents, that survival and victory required embracing the same technologies he'd previously fought against. This belief led him to fake his death and seek out Albert Wesker, who provided him with enhanced plagas and sent him to infiltrate Los Illuminados. Krauser's mission for Wesker involved stealing a dominant strain plaga sample to facilitate Wesker's own bioweapon research. To gain Sadler's trust, Krauser executed Ashley's kidnapping, demonstrating both capability and ideological alignment with Los Illuminados' goals. Sadler rewarded him with dominant strain infection, granting Krauser control over subordinate Ganados, while also giving him mutations that transformed his left arm into a blade capable of killing in single strikes. The mutation represents everything Krauser came to believe about necessity of enhancement. His natural arm was weak, damaged, insufficient. The mutated replacement makes him superhuman, capable of combat performance that unenhanced soldiers can't match. Krauser's knife fight with Leon in the castle ruins becomes ideological confrontation as much as physical combat. Krauser argues that Leon's adherence to purely human capabilities represents weakness, that rejection of bioweapon enhancement dooms Leon to eventual defeat, that survival in a world full of parasites and viruses requires becoming something beyond baseline humanity. Leon counters that enhancement costs more than it provides, that Krauser's power came at the price of his autonomy, that serving Wesker or Sadler isn't strength regardless of physical capabilities gained through that service. The fight mechanics reinforce this thematic conflict. Krauser's mutated arm can kill Leon instantly if attacks connect, representing overwhelming power of bioweapon enhancement. But the mutation also makes Krauser's movements more predictable, creates patterns that can be learned and exploited, introduces vulnerabilities that didn't exist in his natural physiology. Leon wins not through matching Krauser's power, but through maintaining discipline and precision that enhanced opponents often sacrifice when they assume their mutations make tactical thinking less necessary. Luis's dying shot saves Leon from Krauser's final attack in the original, forcing Krauser to retreat rather than finishing the kill. This creates additional tragedy around Luis's death. He saves Leon's life in his final moments, but he dies without witnessing whether Leon successfully reaches the laboratory, removes the plagas, and survives long enough to make Luis's sacrifice meaningful. Redemption remains incomplete, efforts toward atonement interrupted before confirmation that those efforts achieved their intended purpose. After Luis dies and Krauser escapes, Leon continues deeper into the castle, pursuing Salazar, who has relocated to a tower where Ashley is being held before transfer to the island facilities. Leon catches up to them just as Salazar prepares to deliver Ashley to Krauser for transport. Leon throws his combat knife into Salazar's hand, wounding him. One of the verdugos retrieves the knife and returns it to Salazar, while Salazar and his remaining bodyguard retreat into an elevator, taking Ashley with them. The pursuit leads to the tower's upper chambers where Salazar waits for final confrontation. But when Leon arrives, Salazar isn't standing in human form. He's begun merging with the Queen Plaga, the massive organism that asexually reproduces new parasites, the biological foundation of Los Illuminados' ability to create new ganados without requiring parasitic reproduction through conventional life cycles. The queen has been hidden beneath the castle, protected by Salazar personally, treated as sacred relic as much as strategic resource. Salazar's transformation represents the ultimate expression of Los Illuminados theology. He doesn't view merging with the Queen Plaga as losing his identity. He views it as transcendence, becoming one with the divine organism that grants enlightenment to all who accept its gifts. His body fuses with the parasite's mass, creating a grotesque hybrid where his human form remains visible in the creature's mouth. Vestigial but still conscious, still aware, still attempting to communicate even as his biology becomes indistinguishable from the organism that's absorbing him. The boss battle occurs across multiple stages as the Queen Plaga reveals different capabilities. The creature can extend tentacles across the arena, crush Leon between mechanical appendages, and spray acid that dissolves organic tissue on contact. Salazar's human body serves as weak point, the critical target that must be destroyed to kill the hybrid organism. But reaching that weak point requires navigating attacks from a creature whose size and power vastly exceed anything Leon faced in the village. The battle's horror comes not from the creature's appearance, but from what it represents. Salazar chose this. He wasn't forced into merging. He voluntarily allowed the Queen Plaga to absorb him, believing that losing individual existence to become part of something larger represented spiritual achievement rather than biological annihilation. This belief was implanted by Sadler through years of manipulation and parasitic influence, but from Salazar's perspective it feels like genuine religious conviction, indistinguishable from faith because the neural mechanisms producing both operate through identical pathways. Leon kills Salazar by destroying enough tissue that the Queen Plaga can no longer sustain the hybrid form. In his dying moments, Salazar calls out to Sadler, begging for salvation, reaching for the father figure who manipulated him into this position but who isn't present to witness or prevent his death. The cry goes unanswered. Sadler is on the island preparing final stages of his global plan. Salazar's death means losing a useful lieutenant but doesn't threaten Los Illuminados' core operations. The cult can replace him, the research continues without him, and his sacrifice, voluntary from his perspective but engineered from any external view, served its purpose by delaying Leon long enough for Ashley to reach the island facilities where her conversion can be completed under more controlled conditions. Leon finds Luisa's laboratory after Salazar's death, hidden in sections of the castle that only someone with insider knowledge would recognize as containing active research spaces. The removal machine looks medical rather than military, designed to extract parasites without killing hosts. Technology developed by someone who understood he might eventually need it for himself. Leon uses the machine alone, enduring an extraction process that feels like surgery without anesthesia, the machine targeting Plaga tissue specifically, and destroying it while leaving surrounding neural structures intact. The extraction succeeds. Leon is free of parasitic control, no longer at risk of losing autonomy to an organism growing along his spine. But this victory is localized and temporary. Sadler remains alive on the island. Los Illuminados still controls an army of ganados. The cult's research facilities continue producing enhanced parasites and hybrid bioweapons, and Ashley's intended role in infiltrating the US government can be filled by other hosts if Sadler decides her value as leverage outweighs her value as puppet. The castle section establishes several patterns that will continue into the island finale. Isolation enables experimentation because distance from oversight removes constraints on what researchers will attempt. Enhancement through bioweapon integration carries costs that recipients often don't recognize until autonomy has already been compromised. And victories against individual cult members don't meaningfully damage organizations that treat people as replaceable resources rather than irreplaceable individuals. Leon and Ashley leave the castle as explosions destroy sections Salazar rigged to collapse if he was defeated, a final trap that nearly succeeds in burying them under tons of stone. They escape through a tunnel system that leads to a dock where a boat waits, but the boat doesn't offer path to safety. It leads to the island, Los Illuminados' most heavily fortified position, where Krauser has established defenses specifically designed to counter Leon's tactics, where Sadler himself waits to personally ensure Ashley's infection either proceeds as planned or becomes unnecessary through her death if extraction proves impossible. The water looks calm as Leon starts the engine. Ashley asks whether they should attempt to reach the mainland instead of continuing toward the island. Leon explains that Sadler will send Granados after them if they run, that the only way to end this involves confronting cult leadership directly, that retreat only delays the moment when Los Illuminados' plans advance beyond any possibility of interruption. This logic reflects the pattern established in Raccoon City and continuing through every bioweapon incident since. Running from localized threats doesn't work when the organizations creating those threats have global reach and unlimited patience. Survival requires fighting, not because fighting offers guaranteed victory, but because running guarantees eventual defeat. Once the organization catches up, the boat moves across the water toward an island Leon can see in the distance. Smoke rises from industrial facilities, lights mark guard positions along defensive perimeters, and somewhere in that complex, Sadler waits with absolute confidence that centuries of planning and decades of research have created conditions where one government agent can't possibly disrupt operations comprehensive enough to infiltrate nations and sophisticated enough to avoid detection until parasitic control has already spread too widely to contain. Leon checks his weapons. The castle consumed significant ammunition. The island will likely consume whatever remains. And after that, assuming he survives encounters with Krauser's prepared defenses and Sadler's personal capabilities, extraction becomes its own problem, because calling for helicopter evacuation risks exposing the pickup location to Ganado attacks during vulnerable waiting periods. Ashley watches the island approaching, and doesn't ask questions Leon can't answer. She understands now that her kidnapping wasn't about ransom or political pressure. She was meant to become a biological vector, carrying infection back to her father, and watching helplessly as the parasite forced her to spread it to everyone around her, while some part of her consciousness remained aware of what her body was doing without her permission. The extraction saved her from that fate, but it didn't save the other people Sadler might infect instead. Didn't save the Granados, who still serve the cult because no one has access to Luis's machine except Leon and Ashley. Didn't solve the larger problem of organizations willing to use parasites as weapons, regardless of consequences measured in human autonomy. The island grows larger as the boat moves closer. The castle was nightmare-made architecture. The village was a community converted into an army. And ahead lies the place where those nightmares were designed, where the conversion process was perfected, where Los Illuminados leadership operates with security that comes from controlling every element within defensive perimeters, established specifically to prevent exactly the kind of infiltration Leon is attempting. But Leon has survived Raccoon City's collapse and Operation Javier's catastrophe. He's learned how to fight enemies who think strategically, how to exploit weaknesses in bioweapon designs, how to operate alone in hostile territory where every person encountered might be infected and every space might be trapped. The skills aren't sufficient guarantees. Nothing guarantees survival when the opposition includes parasitic mind control and biological weapons that regenerate from damage that should be fatal. But skills are what he has. The boat reaches the dock. Leon secures the line and helps Ashley onto stable ground. The island facilities spread out before them. modern research buildings surrounded by ruins from whatever civilization originally inhabited this location before Los Illuminados claimed it. And somewhere in that combination of past and present, tradition and technology, religious devotion and scientific exploitation, Sadler waits to demonstrate why his confidence isn't baseless ego, but realistic assessment of advantages that one infiltrator can't overcome through combat skills and determination alone. Chapter 3: The Island and the Industrialization of Parasitism. The island facilities represent the endpoint of a specific trajectory in bioweapon development, where Umbrella built laboratories beneath mansions and police stations, disguising research behind legitimate facades. Los Illuminados operates openly within territory they control absolutely. No pretense of pharmaceutical research, no cover stories about medical treatments, just industrial-scale parasite cultivation, bioweapon enhancement, and human experimentation conducted with confidence that comes from controlling every access point and eliminating every potential witness. The architecture reflects different priorities than the castle. Salazar's domain emphasized Gothic theatricality, spaces designed to intimidate and confuse. The island facilities emphasize function. Laboratories contain equipment for genetic modification. Holding cells store test subjects awaiting infection. Incinerators dispose of failed experiments. And monitoring systems track every variable in processes designed to produce parasites optimized for specific purposes, from rapid infection to extended dormancy to enhanced lethality depending on strategic requirements. Jack Krauser has prepared the island specifically to counter Leon's approach to combat. During Operation Javier, Krauser observed Leon's tactics extensively. He knows Leon prefers precision over suppression fire, conserves ammunition through careful shot placement, uses environmental advantages to offset numerical disadvantages, and maintains mobility rather than holding defensive positions. Understanding these patterns allowed Krauser to design countermeasures. Tripwires rigged to explosives punish movement through certain corridors. Automated turrets force Leon into exposed positions, and bear traps scattered throughout ruins convert open ground into a navigation puzzle, where every step requires checking for hidden mechanisms. Krauser's preparation reveals something important about bioweapon enhancement. The mutations gave him physical capabilities beyond human norms. His blade arm can cut through materials that would resist conventional weapons. His enhanced physiology allows movements faster than unmodified soldiers can track, but physical enhancement doesn't automatically grant tactical superiority. Krauser's advantages matter only if he can force engagement on terms that favor raw power over discipline and experience. Leon's goal becomes avoiding those terms, creating situations where Krauser's mutations become liabilities rather than assets. Their confrontation occurs in ruins that predate Los Illuminados' modern iteration. Stone structures from whatever civilization originally worshipped Las Plagas before the Salazar family suppressed the cult centuries ago. The location carries symbolic weight. Krauser chose ruins specifically because they represent what he believes Leon represents: obsolete, outdated, clinging to inadequate traditions while the world moves toward enhancement that renders baseline humanity insufficient for survival. Fighting in these ruins frames their conflict as old versus new, natural versus modified, human versus post-human. Krauser doesn't waste time on ideological debate during the battle. He tested that approach in the castle, and Leon rejected his arguments completely. Now Krauser simply tries to kill him, using mutations to overwhelm defensive positions and force Leon into close quarters where blade attacks become unavoidable. But Leon adapts. He recognizes that Krauser's mutations follow patterns, that enhanced speed creates momentum that can't be redirected mid-attack, that the blade arm telegraphs strikes through necessary positioning before execution. The battle escalates across multiple stages as Krauser triggers transformations that enhance his capabilities further. His body becomes increasingly inhuman, mutations spreading from his arm across his torso and legs, creating biological armor that resists conventional weapon damage. But each transformation consumes energy. forces Krauser to pause briefly while his physiology reorganizes around new configurations. Those pauses create windows where Leon can land critical shots before mutations complete and vulnerability windows close. Ada Wong intervenes at a critical moment when Krauser has Leon cornered with no viable escape route. She fires from an elevated position, forcing Krauser to dodge rather than finishing his attack. This intervention increases Krauser's paranoia about Ada's loyalty to their supposed mutual employer, Albert Wesker. Krauser has suspected throughout the mission that Ada would eventually betray Wesker and keep the Plaga sample for whatever organization actually employs her. Her decision to save Leon, rather than letting Krauser eliminate a potential obstacle, confirms those suspicions while simultaneously preventing Krauser from acting on them, because Leon uses the distraction to reposition. Krauser's death occurs after extended combat that depletes both his enhanced physiology and Leon's ammunition reserves. Leon lands enough damage to critical areas that Krauser's mutations can't compensate through regeneration. Krauser falls, his body reverting partially toward human configuration, as the Plaga loses capacity to maintain enhanced states without sufficient host tissue remaining viable. His final words focus not on ideological vindication but on practical assessment. He notes that Leon won this encounter, but that victories against individual enhanced opponents don't address the larger reality that bioweapon technology continues spreading, that more soldiers will seek enhancement when they recognize conventional capabilities can't match modified alternatives, that Leon's approach works only until it doesn't, and then baseline humanity becomes extinct not through destruction but through voluntary modification. This prediction haunts Leon even though he just killed the person making it. Because Krauser isn't wrong about proliferation, the technology exists, the knowledge is documented, and every time someone like Leon defeats an enhanced opponent, organizations developing those enhancements learn from the failure and design improvements that address whatever vulnerabilities allowed the defeat. This creates an arms race where human capabilities remain static, while enhancement technologies evolve continuously. Eventually, the math stops favoring unmodified soldiers regardless of training or experience. But accepting that logic means accepting that people like Krauser are inevitable, that enhancement becomes mandatory rather than optional, that humanity fragments into modified and unmodified populations where the unmodified become obsolete. Leon rejects this outcome not through argument, but through continued existence. Every mission he completes without requiring enhancement demonstrates that human capabilities haven't become insufficient yet. That baseline physiology combined with training and discipline still produces outcomes that enhanced opponents can't prevent. That the arms race hasn't reached the point where modification becomes necessary for survival. After Krauser's death, Leon retrieves items Krauser was guarding, including keys needed to access deeper sections of the island facilities. Ashley remains in a holding area, kept separate from Leon to prevent them from coordinating during Krauser's planned ambush. Leon finds her again, confirms she's unharmed, and they continue toward Los Illuminados' central research complex, where Sadler conducts his most advanced experiments. The research labs reveal the scope of what Sadler has created. Regeneradores are bioweapons engineered to heal from nearly any damage through Plagueis organisms embedded throughout their bodies. Destroying visible Plagueis temporarily disables regeneration, creating windows where conventional weapons can inflict permanent damage. But identifying which Plagueis to target requires thermal imaging equipment that Leon must locate before engaging these enemies becomes viable, rather than ammunition-wasting futility. Iron Maidens are enhanced regeneradores with extendable spikes covering their bodies, turning them into biological weapons that kill through contact, even when their regeneration is temporarily disabled. They represent iterative improvement on earlier bioweapon designs, addressing vulnerabilities identified during testing by adding defensive capabilities that make approach dangerous regardless of whether regeneration is active. U3 is a hybrid combining human, insect, and plant DNA, creating something that retains human intelligence while gaining predatory capabilities from multiple species. The creature demonstrates what becomes possible when researchers have unlimited access to genetic material and no ethical constraints on experimentation. They simply combine traits until something emerges that proves useful as weapon, regardless of suffering inflicted during creation process or autonomy destroyed through transformation from person into instrument. These bioweapons patrol the island facilities alongside Ganados equipped with military-grade weapons rather than farming tools and improvised arms. The Ganados on the island receive tactical training after infection, making them function as professional military force rather than armed mob. They coordinate suppression fire, establish overlapping fields of observation, and respond to intrusions with discipline that reflects both preserved human intelligence and implanted command structures that prioritize mission completion over individual survival. Leon navigates through laboratories where documentation reveals details about Sadler's plans that intelligence briefings before the mission didn't include. Los Illuminados intended Ashley's infection to serve as proof of concept for a much larger infiltration strategy. If parasitizing the president's daughter and sending her home successfully demonstrated that Plagueis could mature undetected and provide reliable control over hosts in positions of authority, Sadler planned to expand operations across multiple nations simultaneously. Diplomats, military officers, corporate executives, anyone with access to decision-making processes that shape policy or direct resources could be infected during official visits to regions Los Illuminados controlled, or through agents planted in locations where influential people gather. This strategy reflects evolution beyond Umbrella's business model. Umbrella sold bioweapons to whoever paid, treating human suffering as externality that didn't affect profit calculations. Los Illuminados uses bioweapons to build political control, creating puppet networks where infected leaders make decisions that serve cult objectives, while believing those decisions reflect their own judgment. The parasites don't announce their presence. They don't override host personalities completely. They just redirect priorities subtly enough that hosts rationalize changed behaviors as personal evolution rather than biological hijacking. The documentation also reveals disagreement within Los Illuminados about whether this approach serves religious mission or merely uses religion as cover for secular power acquisition. Some researchers describe Sadler as a true believer who genuinely views Las Plagueis as sacred organisms worthy of worship. Others characterize him as opportunist, who recognize that religious framing would attract followers willing to sacrifice themselves for causes they believe transcended material concerns. The truth likely combines both elements. Sadler may sincerely believe Plagueis represent divine gift, while simultaneously recognizing that framing enhances recruitment and loyalty beyond what purely secular ideology could achieve. Regardless of Sadler's internal beliefs, his external actions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how to weaponize faith. People will commit to religious causes with intensity that secular movements struggle to replicate. Martyrdom becomes virtue rather than waste when framed as service to divine purpose. And resistance to authority transforms from tactical necessity into spiritual duty when the authority being resisted claims to oppose God's will. Sadler built Los Illuminados by identifying people experiencing isolation, offering them community and meaning, then gradually escalating commitment through ritual and biological modification until leaving became psychologically impossible even before parasitic control made it physically impossible. This pattern appears throughout real-world cult formation, though usually without literal biological mechanisms enforcing loyalty. Charismatic leaders identify vulnerable populations. They offer solutions to problems those populations face. They create environments where questioning leadership equals betraying community. And they escalate demands gradually so each new requirement seems like a reasonable extension of commitments already made, rather than dramatic departure requiring reconsideration of the entire relationship. By the time members recognize they're trapped in abusive dynamics, social and psychological mechanisms have already isolated them from external support networks that might facilitate escape. Los Illuminados adds a biological layer to this familiar pattern. The social and psychological mechanisms trap people initially. Then parasitic infection makes escape impossible even if psychological manipulation fails. Someone might recognize Sadler's theology contains logical inconsistencies, or that cult practices violate ethical principles they previously held important. But that recognition doesn't grant freedom when plaguists override decision-making regardless of conscious disagreement with orders received. The parasite ensures compliance independent of belief, creating a situation where people can lose faith in the organization while remaining unable to act on that loss of faith. Leon finds Ada again in the research complex. She's searching for something specific, information that Wesker requested beyond just the plague sample. Her presence complicates Leon's mission because their objectives partially overlap and partially conflict. Both want to stop Sadler, but Ada also wants to prevent Leon from interfering with her sample extraction, and her methods for achieving that goal include keeping him in the dark about her actual employer and the full scope of what she's been ordered to obtain. Their interaction reveals the complexity of Ada's position. She helps Leon repeatedly throughout his mission, providing equipment at critical moments, clearing paths through areas she's already navigated, and intervening when enemies would otherwise overwhelm him. But she also maintains operational security that prevents Leon from knowing enough to interfere with objectives that might conflict with his goal of simply rescuing Ashley and escaping. This creates a relationship dynamic where neither person fully trusts the other, despite evidence that they're both working against Los Illuminados at this specific moment. The distrust reflects lessons learned from previous encounters. In Raccoon City, Ada concealed her identity and mission from Leon while using his assistance to access areas she couldn't reach alone. Leon helped her, developed feelings complicated by her deception, and watched her apparently die before discovering she had survived. Now, years later, the pattern repeats. Ada needs Leon alive because his presence disrupts Los Illuminados' defenses in ways that serve her mission. Leon accepts her help despite knowing it comes with attached conditions he doesn't fully understand. Both recognize this dynamic, but proceed anyway because immediate survival concerns override long-term trust issues. Ashley asks Leon about Ada after witnessing one of their interactions. Who is she? Why does she help sometimes but disappear other times? Can they trust her? Leon responds honestly. He doesn't know who she works for. He knows she has her own agenda that isn't identical to his, and no, they can't trust her completely. But so far, her interventions have helped more than harmed, so accepting assistance while remaining cautious seems like a better strategy than refusing help they desperately need. This pragmatic approach to unstable alliances becomes necessary when operating in hostile territory without reliable backup. Leon can't call for military support because Ashley's kidnapping was kept secret to avoid panic and prevent Los Illuminados from killing her. If they learned government forces were mobilizing, he was sent in alone precisely because a small, quiet operation was the only approach that gave Ashley a chance. He can't trust local authorities because the cult controls the entire region, and any official contact would immediately alert Sadler. His only resources are what he carries, what he can scavenge from enemies, and what Ada occasionally provides. Operating under those constraints means accepting help from sources he can't fully verify, because refusing means operating with even fewer resources against opposition that isn't similarly constrained. The path through the research complex leads to a throne room where Sadler waits. He's not surprised by Leon's arrival. He's been tracking Leon's progress through surveillance systems, watching him overcome every obstacle the cult placed in his path. Sadler views Leon's success not as a threat, but as validation that the defenses work well enough to slow determined infiltrators, while still allowing eventual penetration that provides opportunity for direct confrontation, where Sadler can demonstrate his power personally. Sadler explains his plans without concern that sharing them might enable resistance. He notes that Ashley's infection has already served its purpose by demonstrating concept viability to Los Illuminados' financial backers and ideological supporters. Whether she survives and gets returned to her father doesn't matter strategically because the proof of concept exists independent of this specific case outcome. Other hosts can be infected, other infiltrations can be attempted, and Los Illuminados has resources to sustain operations indefinitely, even if this particular plan fails. This monologue reveals why defeating individual cult members doesn't meaningfully damage the organization. Los Illuminados isn't built around irreplaceable people occupying unique positions. It's built around reproducible processes that can be executed by anyone with appropriate training and parasitic control. Salazar's death meant losing one Castellan, but other cult members can administer research facilities. Krauser's death meant losing one infiltration specialist, but Los Illuminados can hire or convert replacements. Even Sadler's death, if Leon manages to achieve it, wouldn't necessarily end cult operations if succession planning distributed knowledge and authority widely enough that organizational continuity persists beyond individual leadership. But there's a vulnerability in Sadler's confidence. He assumes that his dominant plaga makes him invulnerable to conventional attack, that his mutations grant capabilities no baseline human can overcome. This assumption worked against most opponents. Enhanced physiology, regeneration, parasitic control over nearby gonados who can reinforce him during combat. These advantages proved overwhelming in previous encounters. But Sadler didn't account for Aida's intervention, or for resources Leon acquired specifically to counter regenerating bioweapons. The battle begins with Sadler triggering a transformation that reveals his true form. The human appearance was shell maintained through conscious control. Underneath, he's become something that can barely be called human at all. His head fuses with plaga tissue, extending into tentacle structure that connects to a massive arthropod-like body with multiple legs ending in sharp points. His original torso hangs from the plaga's base, vestigial but still conscious, still containing Sadler's awareness, even as his physiology becomes majority parasite rather than majority human. The transformation represents the logical conclusion of Los Illuminados' theology. Sadler didn't just worship Plagueis, he became one, surrendering human form to merge with organisms he considered divine. From his perspective, this represents ultimate enlightenment, transcending limitations of baseline biology to achieve union with sacred beings. From any external perspective, it represents body horror, where a person volunteers for their own annihilation through biological absorption. Leon fights the transformed Sadler across the throne room, targeting weak points while avoiding attacks from leg spikes and tentacle strikes that can impale him instantly if they connect. The battle seems unwinnable until Aida intervenes again, tossing Leon a rocket launcher with enough explosive power to overcome Sadler's regeneration. The weapon shouldn't exist in Leon's inventory under normal circumstances. It's too heavy, too specialized, requires ammunition he hasn't been collecting throughout the mission. But Aida provides it specifically because she needs Sadler dead to complete her objectives, and Leon is the person currently positioned to execute the kill if he has appropriate equipment. Leon fires the rocket launcher during a window when Sadler is vulnerable, destroying enough tissue that regeneration can't compensate. Sadler dies screaming, his consciousness fragmenting as the Plaga body collapses and the human remnants can no longer sustain awareness without the parasitic mass providing life support. His last words reference his master, suggesting that even Sadler serves something beyond himself, some authority or ideology or entity that Los Illuminados' documented history doesn't clearly identify. This ambiguity about who or what Sadler ultimately served never receives resolution. He's dead. His plans are disrupted. But whether Los Illuminados operated as an independent organization or as a subsidiary of some larger network remains unclear. The possibility exists that Sadler was a puppet believing himself master, that parasitic control extended even to cult leadership, that the dominant Plagueis giving him authority over subordinates also made him subordinate to whoever controlled even more advanced parasites. Without access to complete documentation or surviving leadership to interrogate, Leon can't determine whether destroying Sadler dismantled Los Illuminados or merely removed one visible operator from an organization that continues functioning through channels he never accessed. After Sadler dies, Ada retrieves the Plaga sample. She points a gun at Leon, not quite threatening but establishing that she's leaving and he shouldn't attempt to stop her. Leon asks what she's going to do with the sample. Ada responds that she's made arrangements, that the sample will be protected, that he should trust her even though trust isn't something she's earned through previous behavior. Then she activates a timer on explosives planted throughout the island, giving Leon limited time to escape before facilities detonate and eliminate evidence of Los Illuminados research. The moral complexity of this moment deserves examination. Ada helped Leon survive, provided equipment that made Sadler's defeat possible, and activated facility destruction that will prevent other organizations from salvaging Los Illuminados' work. But she's also stealing bioweapon samples for employers whose intentions Leon doesn't know and can't verify. She might deliver the sample to organizations planning to use it responsibly, containing rather than weaponizing it, or she might deliver it to groups that will reverse engineer the technology and deploy enhanced parasites in contexts where Leon has no ability to intervene. Leon has to make a decision whether to stop her. He could attempt to take the sample by force, but doing so means fighting Ada while explosives count down and Ashley waits for extraction. He could demand answers about her employer, but Ada has demonstrated repeatedly that she won't provide those answers under any circumstances. He could simply let her leave, accepting that he can't control what happens to the sample after it leaves the island, and focusing instead on objectives he can achieve like ensuring Ashley's survival and his own escape. He chooses the third option. Ada escapes in a helicopter, taking the sample with her. Leon gets keys to a jet ski and races Ashley away from the island as explosives tear through research buildings, laboratories, and storage facilities. The destruction eliminates Los Illuminados' infrastructure and ensures that whatever samples the cult still possessed can't be salvaged from wreckage. But samples survived in Ada's possession and potentially in other locations Los Illuminados established as backups, precisely to prevent single-point failures from destroying all their work. Bioweapon research doesn't concentrate in one facility when the researchers understand that raids or accidents might destroy primary locations. Los Illuminados operated for years before Leon's arrival. They had time to establish redundancies, distribute samples to allied organizations, and create succession plans that would keep some version of their work alive, even if their Spanish facilities were completely destroyed. The helicopter ride Ada takes provides the mission's actual conclusion. She contacts Albert Wesker to report success in obtaining the sample. Wesker responds with information about his plans for Las Plagas, explaining that the parasite will enable research leading to casualties in the billions, that he views mass death as a necessary catalyst for human evolution, that suffering at that scale represents acceptable cost for advancement towards superhuman capabilities. Ada listens to this explanation, then removes her transmitter and disposes of the subordinate Plaga sample she had set aside for Wesker, keeping the dominant strain for the agency. This betrayal represents Ada's actual loyalty becoming clear. She wasn't working for Wesker, she was working for an organization called the Agency, which hired her to obtain samples while using Wesker as cover for her actual mission. She provided Wesker with a subordinate Plaga sample, functionally useless compared to the dominant strain she kept for the Agency. Her deception worked because Wesker's arrogance made him assume that employees stayed loyal when motivated primarily by payment, that Ada's mercenary reputation meant she'd follow orders without ethical considerations interfering. But Ada demonstrated that she operates according to principles Wesker didn't model correctly. She helped Leon repeatedly despite orders to eliminate him if he interfered. She chose to save his life multiple times when allowing his death would have simplified her mission. And when confronted with Wesker's explicit plan to cause billions of deaths, she rejected participation immediately, rather than accepting increased payment or attempting to rationalize cooperation. This decision matters, because it establishes that resistance to bioweapon proliferation doesn't require superhuman capabilities or institutional backing. Ada is one person working for organizations whose ethics aren't necessarily better than Wesker's, but she made the individual choice to sabotage the mission when she understood its full implications, prioritizing preventing mass death over career advancement or personal enrichment. Individual choices accumulate. Ada's choice meant dominant Plagas went to the Agency instead of Wesker. Leon's choices throughout the mission meant Ashley survived and Los Illuminados facilities were destroyed. Neither person could stop bioweapon proliferation entirely, but both made decisions that shaped how proliferation proceeded and who controlled the samples that would inform future research. Leon and Ashley reach the mainland aboard the jet ski. They're both exhausted, injured, traumatized by experiences that will require years to process psychologically, but they're alive. They're no longer infected, and Ashley is returning to her father with her autonomy intact, rather than as a biological puppet preparing to spread parasites through the American government. The mission succeeded in its immediate objectives. Ashley was rescued. Los Illuminados lost their primary facilities. Sadler was killed, but larger questions remain unanswered. How many other organizations obtained Las Plagas samples through channels independent of Ada's theft? Whether the agency will use dominant Plagas responsibly or develop their own weapons using knowledge Ada delivered. If Los Illuminados has successor organizations that will continue cult operations using different leadership and methodology, and most importantly, whether the pattern of bioweapon development proliferation will eventually reach a point where individual resistance becomes insufficient, where every victory against specific threats merely teaches weapons developers how to design better weapons that address whatever vulnerabilities allowed those victories. Leon doesn't have answers to these questions. He's one agent completing one mission. The larger dynamics of bioweapon proliferation operate at scales beyond individual influence. But he keeps operating anyway, accepting missions, fighting enemies, preventing catastrophes when prevention remains possible, because the alternative is surrendering to inevitability, accepting that proliferation can't be stopped so resistance becomes pointless. And acceptance of that position means bioweapon developers face no meaningful opposition, accelerating the timeline toward outcomes like Wesker's plan for billions of casualties. Individual resistance matters not because it guarantees victory, but because it remains possible. Leon survived Resident Evil 4 without requiring enhancement, proving Krauser wrong about baseline humanity's obsolescence. Ada redirected dominant Plagas away from Wesker, preventing his timeline for mass casualties from proceeding as planned. Ashley maintained enough autonomy under parasitic influence to cooperate with extraction, demonstrating that Plaga control isn't absolute if intervention occurs before maturation completes. These outcomes weren't inevitable. They resulted from specific choices made under extreme pressure by people who could have chosen differently, and those choices accumulated into results that shaped how bioweapon research proceeded afterward. The pattern suggests that continued resistance remains meaningful even when complete victory appears impossible. That individual actions aggregate into consequences that wouldn't occur if everyone accepted that fighting powerful organizations achieves nothing worth the cost. The sun is rising as Leon and Ashley reach shore. They've been operating through the night, fighting through village and castle and island without rest. Now they're escaping into daylight, leaving darkness behind along with the bodies of everyone who tried to stop them and everyone who died helping them. Luis Serra dead in the castle halls, Jack Krauser dead in the island ruins, Ramon Salazar dead after merging with the Verdugo and the Queen Plaga, Osmond Sadler dead after transformation revealed what he'd become beneath his human appearance, and all the unnamed Ganados, farmers and builders and parents who were infected against their will or chose infection under manipulation that made consent meaningless. They're dead too, killed during Leon's fight through their positions, or destroyed when explosives tore through the island. Their deaths weren't their fault. They were victims before they became threats, but that didn't make them less dangerous or give Leon alternatives to killing them when they attacked with clear intent to kill him first. This moral complexity haunts every bioweapon incident. The infected didn't choose infection in ways that meet any reasonable standard of voluntary consent, but they've become dangerous regardless of how they reached that state. And protecting uninfected populations requires stopping infected individuals through methods that often kill them rather than curing or containing them. The infected deserve sympathy as victims. They also require lethal response when they threaten others. Both things are simultaneously true, and pretending otherwise means either abandoning victims to their fates or allowing threats to harm people who could have been protected. Ashley asks Leon what happens next. He explains that they'll debrief with intelligence services, provide information about Los Illuminados' operations, and hope that authorities can locate and eliminate any backup facilities the cult maintained. Then he'll return to regular duties, accepting new missions, continuing work as government agent specializing in bioweapon incidents. This is his life now, has been since Raccoon City forced him into this role. Will continue being until bioweapon threats stop emerging, or until he dies preventing one of them. Ashley is heading back to her regular life, to university and social circles, and the complicated dynamics of being the president's daughter, in contexts where that status brings attention she didn't ask for. But her regular life has been permanently altered by this experience. She'll carry knowledge about parasites that can override human will, cults that weaponize religion, and the reality that institutional protection can fail spectacularly when threats operate through methods security protocols weren't designed to counter. That knowledge changes everything, even when returning to spaces that appear unchanged. And somewhere, in a helicopter heading toward the destination she forced the pilot to reach at gunpoint, Ada Wong carries a sample of dominant Plagueis toward an organization whose ethics and intentions remain deliberately obscured. She made the choice to betray Wesker, but that choice involved trusting the agency to use what she's delivering more responsibly than Wesker would have. She doesn't know if that trust is justified. She has to accept uncertainty as part of operating in a world where every organization has hidden agendas and every alliance is a temporary arrangement based on overlapping interests rather than shared values. The boat carrying Leon and Ashley toward shore cuts through water that reflects sunrise colors. The beauty of the scene contrasts sharply with the horror they've just escaped. Both exist simultaneously, parasites that override autonomy and sunrises over calm water, organizations that conduct human experimentation, and individuals who risk everything to stop them. Weapons designed to cause billions of deaths, and choices to redirect those weapons away from people planning mass murder. Resident Evil 4 doesn't resolve these tensions. It documents them, shows how they manifest in specific situations, and demonstrates that resistance remains possible without guaranteeing it will remain effective indefinitely. The game changed survival horror by making enemies intelligent, by showing that parasitic control creates different challenges than viral infection, by examining how cults weaponize faith and how bioweapon research adapts to fill whatever niches market demand or ideological conviction creates. Leon survived by adapting to those challenges. Ada redirected threats by choosing betrayal over complicity. Ashley maintained enough self to cooperate with her own rescue. And collectively, those individual choices prevented one version of catastrophe while leaving open the question of whether they merely delayed it or actually changed trajectories in ways that matter beyond this specific incident. The answer won't become clear until future crises reveal whether lessons from Resident Evil 4 inform better responses, or whether bioweapon developers learned more from Los Illuminados' failures than defenders learned from temporary successes against them. For now, the sun continues rising, the shore grows closer, and two people who survived parasitic infection, cult indoctrination, and bioweapon attacks that killed everyone else who encountered them prepare to return to a world that doesn't fully understand what they prevented and won't thank them adequately for preventing it. Chapter 4: The Psychology of Parasitism and the Horror of Preserved Consciousness. The fundamental terror in Resident Evil 4 isn't the violence or the monsters or the threat of death. It's the possibility of continuing to exist while losing the capacity to determine what that existence serves. Las Plagas doesn't destroy the person, it hijacks them, redirecting neural pathways so the victim's own intelligence, skills, and memories become weapons used against everything they previously valued. A farmer who spent decades cultivating crops to feed his family continues farming with identical skill but now grows food to sustain cult operations. A mother who protected her children with fierce dedication continues that fierce dedication but redirects it toward attacking anyone who threatens Saddler's plans. The personality persists. The expertise remains intact. Only the purpose changes, and that change occurs through biological mechanisms the host can't consciously resist. This creates horror distinct from what Raccoon City offered. Zombies represented death walking, bodies continuing to move after the person died, hunger without humanity driving them to consume anything living. The horror was visceral and immediate, a loved one's face on a creature that would tear you apart without recognition or hesitation. But zombies didn't force you to wonder whether some fragment of the original person remained trapped inside, aware of what their body was doing, but unable to stop it. Ganados force exactly that question. They're not dead, they're controlled. And in that gap between death and control lies a specific psychological terror that's harder to process than simple mortality. Death ends consciousness, control perverts it, forcing awareness to continue while autonomy disappears. Imagine being fully present in your own mind, experiencing every sensation, processing every thought, but discovering that your body responds to commands you didn't issue and can't countermand. Your hands pick up weapons, your voice coordinates with others to execute tactics, your feet carry you toward targets you recognize as people who shouldn't be hurt, and you can't stop any of it because the parasite has inserted itself between intention and action, allowing intention to exist while preventing it from affecting behavior. Some ganados might experience parasitic control this way, consciousness preserved but imprisoned. Others might experience it as a gradual shift in priorities that feels like natural evolution of beliefs rather than external imposition. The parasite doesn't need to eliminate the host's sense of agency to control them. It just needs to make imposed objectives feel like personal convictions. When neural hijacking is sophisticated enough, victims might genuinely believe their new loyalty to Sadler emerged from rational assessment rather than biological manipulation. They might construct elaborate justifications for behaviors that serve the cult, never recognizing that those justifications are post hoc rationalizations for actions the parasite compelled, rather than logic driving voluntary choices. This mirrors real dynamics in coercive control situations. Abusive relationships, authoritarian organizations, high-demand groups. The mechanisms don't typically announce themselves. Victims don't usually recognize "I'm being controlled" in the moment. Instead, they construct narratives explaining why their changed behaviors represent personal growth or necessary adaptation to circumstances. The controller encourages these narratives, framing compliance as strength and resistance as weakness. Over time, the victim's internal voice becomes indistinguishable from the controller's voice, making external compulsion feel like internal conviction. Los Illuminados weaponized this dynamic by adding a biological layer that made it literally true. Sadler's voice in a ganado's head wasn't metaphor or psychological manipulation. It was direct neural input from dominant plagas to subordinate plagas, command structures embedded in nervous tissue that bypassed conscious decision-making entirely. A ganado who felt certain that serving Sadler represented their authentic choice wasn't wrong about experiencing certainty. They were wrong about that certainty originating from autonomous assessment rather than parasitic override. The village section demonstrates how this control scales. Individual ganados retain their pre-infection skills and knowledge. Farmers still know optimal planting schedules and crop rotation patterns. Builders still understand structural engineering and material properties. Parents still recognize their children and maintain protective instincts. But all of that preserved capability now serves Los Illuminados rather than the people who developed it. The village continues functioning as an agricultural and residential community. Production continues, buildings get maintained, social structures persist, but everything feeds into cult operations instead of sustaining the people doing the work. This represents institutional capture at biological level. The structures remain, the processes continue, the people still perform their roles with competence and dedication, only the beneficiary changes. An outside observer watching the village from a distance might not immediately recognize that anything had changed. People still work the fields, repair houses, gather at the church. The visible markers of normal community life all appear intact. The horror becomes visible only when you get close enough to see the yellow glow in their eyes, and watch them coordinate attacks on strangers with tactical precision that no farming village should possess. Real-world institutional capture operates through similar mechanics, minus the literal parasites. Organizations designed to serve specific populations get gradually repurposed to serve different interests while maintaining the appearance of original mission. A regulatory agency meant to protect consumers becomes staffed by industry insiders who reinterpret rules to benefit corporations over individuals. A religious institution meant to provide spiritual guidance becomes a vehicle for leadership to accumulate power and wealth. The structures persist. The stated mission remains unchanged, but practical operations serve entirely different purposes than the original design intended. Los Illuminados simply made this process explicit and irreversible. No possibility of reform when the people running the institution have biological mechanisms preventing them from prioritizing anything except cult objectives. No gradual drift that could be corrected through awareness and intervention. Just immediate and permanent capture the moment infection matured. Conversion so complete that the captured institution couldn't recognize its own capture as a problem requiring correction. The castle section introduces another dimension. What happens when institutional capture extends to governance itself? Ramon Salazar wasn't just a converted individual. He was a hereditary authority figure whose position granted him legitimate power over the region. His conversion meant legitimate governance became a facade for cult operations, official structures providing cover and resources for activities those structures were supposedly regulating. This pattern appears throughout history whenever authoritarian movements capture democratic institutions. The forms of governance remain. Elections might still occur, legislative bodies still convene, courts still hear cases, but the actual function shifts from serving citizens to maintaining power for whoever controls the apparatus. The scary part isn't that institutions get destroyed, it's that they get preserved and repurposed, their legitimacy weaponized, to justify outcomes that betray their foundational purposes. Salazar believed his conversion represented correcting ancestral sins, atoning for his family's suppression of Los Illuminados by releasing what they'd imprisoned. This belief demonstrates how parasitic influence can hijack even moral reasoning. Sadler presented the unsealing in terms that resonated with Salazar's desire for purpose and significance, framed imprisonment of Las Plagas as sin requiring atonement rather than prudent containment of dangerous organisms, and Salazar's young age, isolation, and existing cruelty tendencies made him vulnerable to manipulation that presented horrific actions as righteous correction. The tragedy isn't that Salazar got fooled by an obvious villain. The tragedy is that, from his perspective, Sadler wasn't a villain but a savior and father figure, offering the meaning and belonging that Salazar desperately wanted. The parasitic control that eventually made resistance impossible began with psychological manipulation that made resistance feel undesirable. By the time biological mechanisms locked him into serving Los Illuminados, Salazar's psychology had already been captured through social and emotional mechanisms that felt like genuine connection rather than predatory grooming. This progression from voluntary association to involuntary servitude appears in many contexts where people get trapped in harmful situations. They join for reasons that make sense given their circumstances and needs. The organization provides something genuinely valuable initially, whether community or purpose or resources or validation. Requirements escalate gradually, each new demand framed as a reasonable extension of previous commitments, and by the time the person recognizes they're trapped in something harmful, exit costs have become so high that leaving feels impossible, even before literal constraints prevent departure. The island facilities represent the endpoint of this institutional evolution, where the village maintained the appearance of a normal community, and the castle preserved forms of traditional governance. The island operates as an explicit research and production facility. No pretense, no deception about purpose, just laboratories where parasites are enhanced and bioweapons are created, staffed by people who either chose this work or were infected to the point where choice became irrelevant. The presence of former Umbrella researchers in Los Illuminados facilities reveals how expertise migrates across organizations, despite stated ethical commitments. These weren't scientists who explicitly wanted to create weapons of mass destruction when they joined Umbrella. They were people who wanted careers in cutting-edge biological research, who accepted positions that provided resources and prestige, who gradually normalized activities that should have triggered ethical objections. When Umbrella collapsed, their expertise remained valuable to any organization willing to ignore international treaties and ethical standards. Los Illuminados hired them not because they were ideologically aligned, but because they had skills that cult bioweapon research required. This pattern explains how atrocities persist across regime changes and organizational transformations. The institutions might fail, the leadership might be prosecuted, the public might express outrage, but the knowledge doesn't disappear. The expertise transfers to new employers. The techniques get refined through iteration. And the next organization developing similar capabilities recruits from the pool of people with relevant experience, regardless of whether that experience came from projects that were shut down specifically because they caused unacceptable harm. Luis Serra embodied this dynamic perfectly. Former Umbrella researcher who brought expertise to Los Illuminados, contributed to developing enhanced plagas and hybrid bioweapons, then developed conscience too late to prevent the weapons from being deployed. His attempt at redemption through helping Leon and stealing samples represented genuine remorse. But remorse doesn't undo damage. The Regeneradors and Iron Maidens he helped create continued existing and killing regardless of his regret about designing them. His death before completing his redemption arc matters thematically. He wanted to atone by preventing further proliferation, by helping remove Plagas from Leon and Ashley, by ensuring his research couldn't be used to cause additional harm, but he died before achieving those goals. Killed by a cult he tried to betray, taking knowledge to his grave that might have helped counter future bioweapon threats. His incomplete redemption reflects an uncomfortable reality. Good intentions and genuine remorse don't guarantee opportunities to make amends. Sometimes people die before repairing damage they caused. Sometimes the systems that enabled their harmful work continue operating despite individual participants developing consciences and attempting to sabotage operations from within. The moral complexity of fighting Gyarados highlights another dimension of parasitic horror. These enemies aren't choosing to attack Leon, they're being compelled by organisms that override their volition. Most Gyarados were farmers and craftspeople and parents before infection, people who would never have voluntarily participated in kidnapping plots or bioweapon research. The parasite made them threats, but the person underneath the parasite didn't consent to that transformation in any meaningful sense. This creates an ethical dilemma for Leon that Raccoon City zombies didn't generate. Zombies were already dead. Shooting them wasn't killing people, it was destroying animated corpses. But Gyarados are still alive in a technical sense. They're breathing, thinking, and experiencing. Killing them means ending the lives of people who might have been savable if plaga removal technology had been available at scale. But that technology isn't available, and Leon can't safely capture and contain dozens of hostile Gyarados while searching for theoretical cures that might not exist or might not work. So he kills them, because they're attacking him and Ashley, because they're executing Sadler's plan to spread parasites globally, because allowing them to succeed means accepting outcomes far worse than the deaths required to prevent those outcomes. But each kill represents a victim twice over. Victim of Los Illuminados when they were infected without genuine consent. Victim of Leon when they're killed because the infection made them dangerous and no viable alternative to lethal force presented itself. This moral weight distinguishes Resident Evil 4 from simpler horror narratives where enemies are purely evil and their deaths are uncomplicated victories. Leon can recognize this tragedy while still choosing to kill them, accepting moral burden as unavoidable cost of preventing worse outcomes, refusing to let guilt paralyze him when paralysis means allowing preventable harm to continue. This framework applies more broadly to conflicts where people are forced to fight victims who've been weaponized by systems beyond individual control, child soldiers who've been abducted and brutalized into service, prisoners forced to fight for entertainment, workers whose economic desperation makes them accept employment causing harm they'd never choose to cause if viable alternatives existed. These people are threats because systems made them threats. Fighting them is sometimes necessary, but that necessity doesn't erase their status as victims or eliminate moral complexity from the violence required to stop them. The game's progression from village to castle to island mirrors escalation in how parasitic control operates. The village represents grassroots infection, individual hosts converted one by one through ceremonies disguised as spiritual purification. The castle represents institutional capture, legitimate governance repurposed to serve cult objectives while maintaining the appearance of traditional authority. The island represents industrialized production, bioweapon development at scale with infrastructure explicitly designed for research and enhancement rather than pretending to serve other purposes. This progression suggests that parasitic threats evolve through predictable stages. Initial spread occurs through personal relationships and community structures, parasites traveling through existing social networks. Institutional capture follows as infected individuals in positions of authority redirect organizational resources toward expanding infection. Industrial scaling comes last, once enough infrastructure and expertise has been captured to support dedicated facilities operating without pretense of legitimate purpose. Understanding this progression matters for developing countermeasures. Early intervention targets the grassroots level, identifying and quarantining infected individuals before they can spread parasites through their communities. Mid-stage intervention requires recognizing institutional capture, identifying when organizations claiming to serve legitimate purposes have been repurposed to advance infection. Late-stage intervention faces the hardest challenge, destroying dedicated infrastructure while preventing researchers and samples from dispersing to establish operations elsewhere. Leon's mission addressed late-stage threat, destroying island facilities after Los Illuminados had already achieved industrial scaling. This guaranteed that even complete success would leave questions about whether enough samples and expertise escaped to establish successor organizations. Earlier intervention might have prevented Los Illuminados from reaching this point, but earlier intervention required recognizing the threat before it became obvious, identifying dangerous trajectory from warning signs that don't automatically indicate parasitic cult planning global infiltration. This reflects a recurring challenge in preventing institutional harms. The warning signs that seem obvious in retrospect often appear ambiguous or innocuous when they're occurring. A charismatic leader offering meaning to isolated individuals, an organization promoting alternative health treatments, a research group pursuing cutting-edge biological studies in remote facilities. None of these automatically indicate danger, but under specific conditions they represent early stages of patterns that culminate in outcomes like Los Illuminados. The difficulty is developing criteria for intervention that identify genuine threats without generating false positives that suppress legitimate activities. How do you distinguish a harmless community group from early-stage cult recruitment? How do you separate legitimate research from bioweapon development when both involve studying parasites and host organism interactions? How do you recognize institutional capture when the institutions being captured still perform their stated functions competently? Resident Evil 4 doesn't provide answers to these questions. It demonstrates consequences of failing to intervene early, while acknowledging that intervention carries its own costs and risks. Leon succeeds in his mission but can't undo damage already done or prevent all future proliferation of knowledge and samples. The game treats this as tragedy rather than failure. Individual victories matter even when they can't solve systemic problems. Preventing one catastrophe is meaningful even when other catastrophes remain possible. And fighting threats once they become obvious is necessary even when earlier intervention would have been preferable if warning signs had been interpretable at the time. The contrast between Leon and Krauser illuminates another thematic element, whether enhancement through bioweapon integration represents evolution or corruption. Krauser believed baseline humanity had become obsolete, that survival required embracing modifications that grant superhuman capabilities. His mutation made him faster and stronger, gave him weapons built into his physiology, provided regeneration that conventional biology couldn't match. From his perspective, Leon's refusal to enhance himself represented stubbornness or cowardice, clinging to inadequate form when superior alternatives existed. But Leon's victory over Krauser demonstrated that enhancement carries costs Krauser didn't adequately weigh. The mutation made Krauser powerful, but also made him controllable. His Plaga responded to Sadler's commands regardless of Krauser's intentions. His alliance with Wesker provided resources but also created obligations. His physical advantages were substantial, but came attached to dependencies and vulnerabilities that baseline physiology avoids. Leon remained human in a biological sense. No regeneration, no built-in weapons, no connection to parasitic command networks. This meant he was objectively weaker than Krauser in direct physical comparisons. But it also meant he retained complete autonomy over his actions, owed loyalty only to commitments he chose rather than parasites that compelled, and could operate without requiring supply chains for suppressants or check-ins with handlers who provided enhancement in exchange for service. The question the game poses through this contrast is whether strength that costs autonomy is actually strength, or just a different flavor of weakness. Krauser could kill more efficiently than Leon, but he'd surrendered the capacity to choose who he killed for and why. His power served purposes determined by whoever controlled his parasite rather than purposes he selected independently. And when those purposes conflicted with his survival, when Sadler's objectives required Krauser's death, the power that made him formidable couldn't protect him from being sacrificed. For priorities, the parasite ensured he'd prioritize over self-preservation. Leon's survival without enhancement suggests that baseline human capabilities remain sufficient when combined with training, discipline, and willingness to accept help from others. He didn't defeat Los Illuminados alone. Aida provided equipment, Luis offered suppressants and laboratory access. Ashley cooperated despite her infection. The victories came through coordination and adaptation rather than individual superiority. Leon remained human and won anyway, not because humanity is inherently superior, but because the specific advantages enhancement provided didn't outweigh costs in autonomy and dependency that enhancement imposed. This speaks to broader anxieties about technological enhancement and human modification. We live in an era where genetic engineering, neural interfaces, and pharmaceutical cognitive enhancement are transitioning from science fiction to practical possibility. The question is no longer whether humans can be enhanced, but whether enhancement serves human flourishing or creates new forms of control disguised as empowerment. Resident Evil 4 suggests caution without condemning enhancement absolutely. The problem wasn't that Krauser modified his biology. The problem was that modification came packaged with parasitic control that made his enhancement serve someone else's purposes. Enhancement that preserves autonomy might avoid these costs, but enhancement that requires ongoing relationships with organizations controlling the technology creates dependencies that transform empowerment into subjugation. This same logic applies to contemporary technologies. A smartphone enhances cognitive capabilities dramatically, providing instant access to information and communication that previous generations couldn't imagine. But it also creates dependencies on corporations controlling the platforms, generates data used for surveillance and manipulation, and introduces vulnerabilities that didn't exist when human cognition operated without digital augmentation. The enhancement is real. The costs are also real. Whether the trade-off serves human interests depends on implementation details that users often can't control or even fully understand. The game's ending refuses simple resolution. Leon and Ashley escape, Sadler dies, the island facilities are destroyed. But Ada leaves with dominant Plaga samples. The agency's intentions remain unclear. Los Illuminados might have backup facilities and stored samples that survived the destruction, and even if every sample were destroyed, the knowledge of how to create and enhance Plagas exists in documents and researchers' memories. meaning the threat can resurrect as long as someone with resources and willingness to ignore ethical constraints decides to pursue the research. This ambiguous conclusion reflects a realistic assessment of how bioweapon proliferation actually works. Individual incidents get resolved, specific facilities get destroyed, particular organizations get dismantled, but the knowledge persists. The techniques transfer to new researchers. The market demand continues from state actors and non-state groups seeking asymmetric advantages, and each iteration learns from previous failures, designing better security, more robust organisms, and more sophisticated delivery mechanisms that address vulnerabilities exploited during prior defeats. Leon can't stop this cycle through individual action. He can disrupt specific operations, prevent particular catastrophes, and buy time for other interventions to develop. But systemic change requires addressing conditions that make bioweapon research profitable and attractive, creating international enforcement mechanisms with teeth, and building verification systems that detect violations before weapons reach deployment stage. None of those systemic solutions fall within his authority or capability. He's an agent executing missions, not a policymaker restructuring international security frameworks. The game treats this limitation as fact rather than failure. Individual resistance matters even when it can't solve everything. Leon's mission succeeded in its objectives. Ashley was rescued. Los Illuminados lost significant resources. Sadler's plan for infiltrating the US government was disrupted. These outcomes have value despite not preventing all future bioweapon threats. The people who would have died if Ashley had been converted and returned to spread parasites through Washington survived because Leon stopped that particular scenario. That victory counts even if it doesn't end bioweapon development globally. This perspective offers a framework for action in situations where complete victory appears impossible. You can't fix everything. You can fix specific things. You can't prevent all harm. You can prevent particular harms. You can't eliminate systemic problems through individual effort. You can address manifestations of those problems when they appear within your sphere of influence. And if enough people make similar choices, the accumulated effect can bend trajectories even when no single actor possesses sufficient power to redirect them unilaterally. The horror in Resident Evil 4 ultimately derives not from monsters or violence, but from confronting limitations in human agency. The Ganados lost agency to parasites. Leon retains agency but recognizes its boundaries. Aida operates with agency but understands that her choices occur within constraints imposed by employment and circumstance. Ashley regained agency through parasitic removal, but carries permanent awareness of how easily agency can be lost to biological invasion that feels like personal conviction rather than external compulsion. Living with these limitations requires accepting that autonomy is fragile, that control is conditional, that systems exist which overwhelm individual resistance, but accepting these facts doesn't require surrendering to them. The village still fell, the castle still housed horrors, the island still produced bioweapons, but Leon walked through all three and survived, preserving his humanity and Ashley's despite every pressure to accept enhancement or surrender to infection or abandon resistance as futile. The sun that rose at mission's end illuminates a world that remains dangerous, where threats continue developing, where knowledge proliferates beyond any possible containment, but it also illuminates possibilities that remain open, futures that haven't been foreclosed, choices that still matter despite not mattering absolutely. Leon made choices that prevented specific harms. Those harms would have occurred if he'd chosen differently. The prevention counts as victory even when new threats emerge to replace defeated ones. This is the wisdom Resident Evil 4 offers. Not that heroism solves everything, or that individual action defeats systemic evil, but that resistance remains possible and meaningful within constraints that can't be eliminated through force of will or tactical excellence. The game respects both the horror of limitation and the significance of choice, refusing to pretend that baseline humanity suffices for all challenges, while also refusing to accept that enhancement at cost of autonomy represents only a viable response. Las Plagas will persist in some form. The samples survived, the knowledge exists. Future organizations will pursue similar research for similar reasons, but Leon proved that enhanced opponents can be defeated, that parasitic control isn't absolute until maturation completes, that institutions conducting human experimentation can be disrupted even when they control entire regions. These demonstrations matter because they preserve hope as realistic response rather than naive delusion. Realistic hope accepts that problems are harder than individual solutions can address, while maintaining that partial solutions still improve outcomes compared to surrendering without resistance. Leon can't stop bioweapon proliferation, but he can stop specific bioweapon deployment. And between those two realities lies space for meaningful action that acknowledges limitation without accepting futility. The game ends, the credits roll, and somewhere, biological research continues in facilities Leon doesn't know exist, conducted by people he's never met, funded by organizations whose names he's never heard. But somewhere else, people who would have died under Los Illuminados' plan continue living because Leon prevented that plan from succeeding. Both realities coexist, neither eliminates the other. And in that tension between ongoing threat and prevented catastrophe, Resident Evil 4 locates its deepest truth about horror, agency, and the complicated victories available to people fighting systems larger than individual power can overcome. For now, the nightmare ends, but nightmares don't stop coming just because you survived one. They evolve, they adapt, they learn from failures, and design better methods for achieving the same terrible outcomes through refined techniques. And the people who fight them keep fighting anyway, not because victory is guaranteed, but because resistance remains possible, and the costs of surrender exceed the costs of continued struggle, even when struggle offers no promise of permanent resolution. This is everything you don't know about Resident Evil 4. Not the wiki details, or the plot summary, or the tactical guide for defeating bosses, but the deeper currents about what parasitic control means for autonomy, what intelligence means for horror, what enhancement costs when it comes with dependencies that transform empowerment into enslavement, about why fighting victims who've been weaponized carries moral weight that simple combat against evil enemies doesn't generate, about how institutional capture operates when it's biological rather than merely political, about what it means to resist when complete victory isn't available and partial victory is the only kind that's possible. The lights come up, the video ends, and you're left with questions more than answers. Questions about whether you'd recognize parasitic influence if it operated on you, whether you'd choose enhancement if it seemed to offer advantages you desperately needed, whether you'd keep fighting threats that adapt faster than defenses can evolve, whether individual choice matters when systemic forces overwhelm individual capacity. Resident Evil 4 doesn't answer these questions, it poses them. Through Leon's survival and Krauser's death, through Ada's calculated ambiguity and Luis's incomplete redemption, through Ashley's rescue and the Granados tragedy, through victories that prevent catastrophes without eliminating conditions that make future catastrophes likely. The game presents scenarios and lets you decide what they mean, what lessons they offer, what implications they carry for navigating a world where threats evolve faster than solutions and where resistance matters without guaranteeing outcomes. That's the gift horror offers when it's working properly. Not escape from reality's problems, but frameworks for processing them, scenarios that make abstract concerns concrete. Characters whose choices illuminate options available when easy answers don't exist. Resident Evil 4 delivers that gift through parasites and villages and castles and islands, through intelligence preserved but enslaved, through choice exercised within brutal constraints, through partial victories that count for something without counting for everything. This is what remains when the zombies disappear and the thinking enemies emerge, when infection preserves the person but perverts their purpose, when fighting back succeeds without solving the underlying problem, when morning comes after the nightmare, and the world continues exactly as dangerous as it was but with one fewer catastrophe that would have occurred if resistance hadn't happened.